I'm willing to do something like that, but how would they know it was members of the media?
Well, they're standing outside in the hallway with a bunch of cameras around them. I don't know. It seems to me somewhat
They
self-evident.
should all wear fedoras with the press.
We could certainly go back to those days, huh?
I'm just thinking of how to handle this.
Right.
Should I just start by asking the jurors as collectively, is there anyone discussing this case as they exited the jury room at 11?
Yeah, I think that'll work.
And they have to do individual review on that basis.
If any of them raise their hands, or yeah.
All right, as the jurors are being escorted out after, when we recess or adjourn for the day, I'll have everybody, media or not, step back against Judge Shapiro's courtroom wall, and the jurors will have to leave collectively. Okay.
They don't come back towards our courtroom. I stand at the exit door and they all go out. So is it in front of ex parte, you're saying, or back here?
I didn't witness it.
Okay, because I am out there with them and they go straight from our jury room out the hall into the elevator
There are sometimes media, though, beyond.
at ex parte.
One member of the media asked Ms. Hill at 11 if they could interview the jurors. Really? As you've noticed, it's getting more and more crowded out in the hallways here. I have a lot of power in this room. I have a lot less power in the hallway. practically none of the street. You need to inquire whether any juror heard any comments, I'm just asking you to raise your hand at this point, heard any comments from anybody as you left the courtroom and headed towards the elevators this afternoon when you left. Okay? That's the answer I have. Okay, Mr. Gordon.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I think I left off and had explained that 15 minutes is a limited period of time in which to gather a lot of really important information about individuals that are going to make a profoundly significant moral question about killing as a punishment for the crime of killing. So we wanted jurors that would respect the law, that would follow the law, would have respect for each other, even if there were to be disagreements or heated disagreements over how to view and interpret and value evidence, or how to apply the law to evidence, because sometimes it gets very complicated. And I think we know that from some of the requests that you sent out from the jury room as it relates to your deliberations on the issue of mental illness and the not guilty by reason of insanity plea. Just as importantly, we wanted jurors that were intelligent and that expressed an understanding that life is complex and that in many instances there are gray areas that are incredibly difficult and sometimes impossible to understand, that notwithstanding some rigorous analytical processes being applied, time and energy spent, no answer seemingly presents itself, but it still requires the mental effort and labor to parse through, unpack, and make sense of to the extent possible. And in this particular case, with the types of issues that we expected, we knew that that type of juror would be required in order to give Mr. Monfort a fair trial. We wanted jurors that in actuality, based on their questionnaires and the responses to the questions that we asked during voir dire, that would be able as well as willing to give meaningful consideration to mitigation. And that means a lot more than simply expressing the words, yes, I'd consider everything. Certainly our judgments were a lot more careful as it relates to your responses in making an assessment, because meaningful consideration of mitigation is what the law requires. And that's what we're about to start in this case, is your meaningful consideration of mitigation. And of course, the prosecutor has a role to play, and that role is somewhat, I would perceive as dismissive of mitigation as it relates to Mr. Monfort in this particular set of case, as he argues aggressively. Just look at the facts. Just go back and look at those horrific facts. And of course, we know they're horrific, and we're not denying the horrific nature of the crime, nor the tragic consequences that came along with it. So here we are. A day I fervently hoped would never arrive. A day that I dreaded. And as I stand here to address you and plead for our client's life, I stumble a little bit because I feel fear. I'm fearful that something I say or something I have said in the past during the past 6 months while we've been in trial would have offended or upset one or more of you. Probably happened. And that human nature being as it is, that mistake of mine might get reflected in your consideration of the value of Chris's life. I certainly pray that that doesn't happen. I fear that there's nothing in my education, my training, my experience, my knowledge of the law, that in any remote sense adequately prepares me to do what I'm trying to do right now. To stand here and present an argument worthy of having a human being's life staked to it. I feel like the weight of the world is on the shoulders of Stacy McDonald and Carl Orr and myself. As burdensome as that is, in a very brief period of time, the greater burden will be yours. Because each of you bears the burden to individually make that godlike decision on Chris's life. To continue it, to allow it to continue to its natural life, its natural end, or by your verdict to decree that life imprisonment, as serious a penalty as that is not adequate punishment, and you end life on your terms and on your calendar, on your time frame, on your schedule. No decision that you could ever make would ever be remotely close to as important as that decision. I do not envy your task. I know that this is a decision that you will have to find peace with for the rest of your life. There are some things in the law that Ms. McDonald alluded to that are specifically enumerated in the statute as what lawyers call statutory mitigating factors. Ms. McDonald alluded to them. Mr. Castleton spoke a little bit about them. But basically, the Washington State Legislature has, for some reason known best to them, decided that these are areas that are so important that they're going to get specified in law, so they have an anchor. And what it means is that if you find evidence, even a small amount of evidence that in your mind satisfies one of these specified statutory factors, or any mitigation for that matter, then that in and of itself is an adequate basis to extend mercy and give a life sentence. The categories that in some sense are applicable to Mr. Monfort are, Mr. Monfort doesn't have a significant record of criminal activity. I think the prosecuting attorney's office conceded that. In the opening statement in the guilt phase, it might have been alluded to. If it wasn't, it sure was conceded in his opening remarks to you here earlier this morning. The legislature has said that that is significant. The fact that it's number one on the list doesn't mean anything. There's no hierarchy. It's no more important than any other mitigating evidence, but it clearly fits Mr. Monfort. He qualifies. He's 46 years old, and on September 13th of this year, he's going to be 47 years old. He's been in custody for a good long time. But for 41 years, he managed to manage his affairs and not accumulate a criminal conviction. The murder of Timothy Brenton was committed while Chris was under the influence of extreme mental disturbance. That's the second one. And that's different language than you dealt with in the first phase of the trial. It simply is an extreme mental disturbance afflicting Chris at the relevant time. At the time of the murder, number 3, the capacity of Chris to appreciate the wrongfulness of his conduct. Again, this is new language. You know from instruction number 1, the first paragraph, that Judge Kessler said those old instructions don't apply. Cross them out of your mind to the extent that that somebody's capable of doing that. It's a difficult thing. That the capacity of Chris to appreciate the wrongful of his conduct, or alternatively, to conform his conduct to the requirements of law, was substantially impaired as a result of mental disease or defect. Again, new language. Number 4, and I'll talk about these individually. The age of Chris at the time of the offense calls for leniency. And the prosecutor was dismissive of that and says, well, what the heck does that mean? And I guess in a sense that might be a legitimate complaint because the legislature hasn't seen fit to specify what age, if any, might be important, whether it be youth or whether it be advanced age. And of course, Chris doesn't fit either end of the poll. He is in the middle. But as it relates to age, we'll talk about that a little bit as well. That Chris is unlikely to pose a danger to others in the future. And that one's significant as well, and you've heard a lot of testimony about that. The 6th one is the general mitigation that in a few minutes, Mr. Lurr, and it will be only a few minutes, will be get up in addressing you specifically about the wealth of general mitigation specific to Chris that is important and relevant in this case. If any of you find that there's any amount of evidence significant to support any one of those, that's adequate. You can truncate your personal deliberations and find yourself satisfied that there's a basis to return a life verdict or extend mercy in this case. It entitles you to stand there solid with the presumption of a life sentence. There's a couple of things. It always bears repeating, any mitigating circumstance is sufficient to give a life sentence, and even if no mitigation is found, mercy alone is a lawful basis upon which you are empowered to give a life sentence. Chris's record, 0. As I said, conceded. It was kind of an interesting anecdote. Mr. O'Brien testified during the guilt phase, and there was, I guess, a kind of a private inside joke that they shared with each other, that it seemed ironic in some sense that Mr. O'Brien, the white young man, had a criminal record, and his friend Mr. Monfort, violating, I guess, a common stereotype, had no record. But it, I think, for all intents and purposes, is conceded. This man has not lived a criminal lifestyle, and he has not accumulated a criminal conviction, and he has no significant record. That alone is enough. Chris committed the murder under the influence of extreme mental disturbance, or he couldn't conform his conduct to the requirements of the law. Both these second and third factors, they relate to the mental illness in every aspect. As I said earlier, every aspect of the evidence that was provided to you by the, you might describe it as burdensome or tortuous, but the lengthy testimony, the detailed testimony of Dr. Cunningham and Dr. Schouten and the lay witnesses are things that need to be at this time reflected on and analyzed through the new language of the new standard and the new burden, because it's all changed. And we're not seeking to relitigate insanity. It's a different question, different proceeding, different issue. And it all has to be looked at anew. One of the things that you might find difficult is the language mental disease or defect that may not rise to the level of insanity. And that's the last part of the instruction. And of course, if the mental disease or defect had risen to the level of insanity, as a matter of law, we of course wouldn't be here. Mr. Monfort would have been declared not guilty by reason of insanity, presumably then civilly committed and at a forensic unit of Western or Eastern State Hospital. But I think it's clear enough that it's certainly less than was required before, and of course there's the change, the shift in the burden as well as the standard. So there was 6 weeks of battling kind of over that issue. That's a lot of testimony. You know, a wealth of it is available in the reports of Dr. Cunningham, Dr. Schouten. I think we very thorough in identifying the narrow areas of differences between their two opinions. There's a social history that is richly detailed and well sourced for its content, that gives an elaborate tapestry, an image, if you will, of Mr. Monfort's upbringing, his life, and his, well, it's a snapshot. And then there's, of course, the testimony and the videos, and all those hours are available for you to read. And there you see Mr. Monfort. You've seen him in court. You see how he presents. You see things consistent with the conclusion that, of course, there's no malingering here. This man doesn't hide from anything. Part of his mental illness is that his belief system is so powerful, nothing is going to ever have him deny that he is right on his beliefs. You have to look at that mental illness anew. You know, I guess, could theoretically decide that there is no mental illness. That would be, I think, a shocking eventuality. Not only have you seen him interviewed forensically, you know the facts of the case. And you know the history of how he got to where he is. And you started to know it from the opening statement when I talked about one of the first cathartic moments was his witnessing of the King beating in 1991. And then you see it show up in the forensic interview with Dr. Schouten. And he's talking about, it seemed like hundreds of them standing around beating him, and they're taking turns. And I'm wondering why they don't just arrest them and stop that nonsense, or words to that effect. That's, of course, a paraphrase. Just stop that nonsense. So that on a history of course, what Dr. Schouten recognizes is a horrific childhood that involved all manner of privation and difficulty that the state is somewhat dismissive of. Yeah, it existed, but big deal, kind of. Well, it is a big deal. An extremely difficult upbringing, very difficult life experience, lots of abandonment, displaced attachments, reactions to that abandonment, being isolated, separated from his mom, never having a stable relationship with his father, being bullied as a child, victim of racism as a child, on an ongoing basis, struggling in school, physical fights, just adrift. Well, there was an expression, and you know what it is, because Mr. Monfort put it on one of the tapes. Somebody, he thinks his mom, told him that, well, every kid's hell is their own. Well, here's a situation where you've had an opportunity to take a look at a set of circumstances, at a body of circumstances, a history, where a kid's hell actually probably existed in powerful ways. And of course, you get to the question of choices, because, you know, the prosecutor says, well, everybody has choices, and your jury questionnaires are of real significance, you know, kind of on this issue to us. Because every one of you recognized on the question of inquiring about what effects should childhood trauma have an effect on the punishment determination in this case. And there was a place for a narrative, and all of you answered, of course, differently. But every one of you recognized that these are formative things. Somebody said, it's huge, this defines who you are. Other people, you know, used other terms that were more tempered and said, sure, everything affects you. And then there was kind of a divergence, because some people then added a tail. And the tail would be but when you're an adult, you're responsible for adult choices. Some people were not quite so skeptical of what the impact of childhood trauma of an unspecified type might have on adult outcomes, adult behavior, and maybe even affliction with mental illness. So there's a fork in the road amongst you with regard to perspective. What I hope and what I pray is true is that close attention was paid to a child psychologist that recently testified, Dr. Brown, who's an expert in the field. Now, Dr. Shelton said all of these things and, furthermore, carried it through to his adulthood, talked about him getting into school, and then I interpret that as him finding a way to address many of the injustices that he has experienced in his life. And then he goes on to say the educational system, he got involved found a place in the educational system and started to think about these things, that he wanted to take on the role. He wanted to be a do-gooder. He wanted to take on not quite superhero, although he does. He wants to do the right thing, and he wants to do good. He wants to correct injustice. Okay. So Dr. Shelton, the state's expert, if they want to argue about it, takes this horrific childhood, these traumas, and says, yeah, it has an impact, and here it is. It progresses through this, and then it shows up here. And of course, he linked it later on in his testimony to the offenses and how they relate. So I would hope that between Dr. Shelton, who gave kind of a skeletonized version, and Dr. Bram, who put some flesh on the bones and said, here's how damage happens. Here's at what stages it begins. And here's how it's carried forward. And this is the reason why you can get these bad adult effects. And it doesn't go away. And the end kind of result was, here is a situation as a result of this damage where you got a 30-year-old and a 15-year-old body. He never matured emotionally beyond adolescence. And Shelton says he wanted to take on not quite superhero, although he does. He wants to correct injustice. And all of the evidence in this case, whether from a witness stand or from the videos of the forensic interviews or from your observations of him in court or testimony by lay witnesses, is consistent with that delusional thought process. His equating of police officers as modern-day redcoats, that's idiosyncratic. That they're bullies, they're rapists, they're thieves, they're murderers, and this is the single greatest problem facing society in this country today. And it's going to have to be addressed. And the one that wants to address the injustice of what to him seems an overwhelming amount of video stimulation of police misconduct and police misconduct and police misconduct and police misconduct ends up being a damaged child and a mentally ill adult. And remember, the damage is caused when you're a child. So there's a real need to look hard at Dr. Graham and Dr. Shelton's testimony. They coalesce. They say the same things. It's just one is more elaborate, more detailed, because she's a specialist in child development. and she has much broader experience in addressing those areas clinically as well as forensically. It's her niche. You can't just dismiss that mitigation. That's his life. And for 41 years, he was able to hang on. And the prosecuting attorney says, no, it's just about choices and adult choices. And, of course, he's an educated man and an intelligent man. So let's just take a look at the education that you would see in the mitigation in this case. We don't know what happened in Las Vegas, but we know when he gets to Hartford City, things don't go well at the Catholic school, it's public school. You know the continuity here. Issues start at about 8 years old. It's a racist community. He's not thriving. We know about Bethel, and we know what that's like, and we know about coming back to Hartford City, and we know what Violetta Wolf described in great detail about a kid that presented, that was failing, that was below his capabilities, that was so stressed he shook and could say, I bet you think I'm really dumb. That's damage. That's damage at an early age that wasn't getting repaired. And it's damage that Dr. Brams has said doesn't just go away. And it certainly doesn't go away unless there's intervention. And we know that there wasn't any adequate intervention. You know, it's not just the doctors. They give you a window into Christopher Monfort's mental illness. It's the lay witnesses as well. And you know who they are. You know, I mean, there was Jane Storrs, not a psychiatric nurse, but a nurse with some training. And she fits right into the Malika Calhoun time and describes in considerable detail what the impact on a bullying incident is on Christopher Monfort, one that he can probably relate to particularly well, and that involved a mixed race child, adolescent, young girl. And she described it in a fashion where it was as if it was happening to him. And that's probably exactly how he felt, because he had considerable experience being bullied. And you know from the video how that is described as being what tipped him over the edge. We know there are other things that were of concern to him. There's a progression. He was concerned about leukemia. He's studying the issue now at Highline. He's gaining sophisticated knowledge. He's understanding more about the law and how it should work. He's understanding what responsibilities and obligations of all of the parties are, and he's seeing some failures, some systemic failures. And of course, the normal thing to do is to go out and try to effectuate some reforms in the usual ways, you know. Pressure on politicians, committees, protests, march in the street, you know, all of the normal ways. But Chris is damaged, and he can't do that, because as Dr. Brams indicated, there's an isolation and a secretiveness where you don't have these social relationships that become rubber bands or elastic that help you get over rough spots. And so he continued to dwell on and saturate his consciousness with videos that were feeding his delusion, until eventually he decides that he is the person that is capable on his own by his actions in causing systemic reform in police departments by the raw exercise of power, and that if he kills a couple police officers, they'll get the message and they'll reform themselves. That's idiosyncratic. That's a delusion. That's a product. That's a mental illness. Educated people and intelligent people don't think in those terms unless they're mentally ill. And he is. And there's no denying it, and there's no denying the fact that that's mitigation. Beyond the mental illness, of course, there's other factors. Ms. Collins, can you pop up number 5? You know, you had Dr. Cunningham, and I know there were 440 plus or minus slides, and I know when Mr. Luer asked Dr. Cunningham, well, how many slides, there was a wave of relief that washed over all of your faces when he said only 42. Well, there's only 4, and I will race through this because he just testified. It's unrebutted, but it's mitigation and it needs to be fully understood. There's different ways to approach it. The only one that really makes any sense scientifically and is the most valid is actuarially, group statistical, and Dr. Cunningham is one of the preeminent national experts on this issue and has done a huge body of the academic research and publishing in this area. The next slide, please. There's a graphic look at 41 years of age and what, with 33,817 inmates, it looks like, as far as the frequency of that bottom line is the one that relates to assaults with serious injuries. And of course, the pink one is simply potential violence. So by the time you're 41 years of age, you're almost at 0. Next slide, please. The federal capital looks about the same. It doesn't matter where you go, whether it's Florida or Oklahoma or Texas, Oregon, the federal system, you get the same data. Next slide, please. Here it is specific to Mr. Monfort. He'll be 46. On September 13, he'll be 47. The single biggest predictor of lack of violent outcomes or violent activities or discipline for aggression or violence is age. Nonviolent disciplinary infractions, I think there were 5 with multiple violations on occasions, and Dr. Cunningham, I know you remember, he said what they involved. Too many towels, trying to keep himself from being wheeled up. You remember all of it. He has a bachelor's degree. People with a GED are half as likely of engaging in violence in prison as people without a GED. Bachelor's degrees, Dr. Cunningham said, they're rare and they have a stabilizing effect on other prisoners. The history of community employment, that's a pro-social thing that fits Mr. Monfort. He's been a working man, a blue-collar guy, a truck driver, pays his taxes, rent, and work. That's his history of community employment. That's a positive factor. These people know how to occupy themselves. They have developed proper kind of approaches to pro-social things. Continued contact with community members. This is a really difficult thing. Well, community members, some of them are here in court, and you've heard from some of them with regard to their testimony. They talked about Chris Monfort so that you can have somewhat of a picture of what his life was like and what he was like. Pure mitigation. Now they visit him. And you heard the testimony. Mom, 450 times as of 2014. Cam, 9 times. Mary, 14 times. Ralph, 15. Might be a little off on those numbers. Toy, he's still married. She visits. And other individuals, cousins, when they come into town, and aunts and uncles. So, that's a good thing, to rebut any notion that somebody might engage in misconduct in prison. And it's a good thing in general, because it says that these people, notwithstanding all of the emotions that they went through in adjusting to the knowledge, disbelief at first, that their cousin or their son or their putative uncle had done this thing that to them was so out of character and so horrific, had actually done that, and they had to adjust to that fact, but they did. And they've expressed love and affection for him because they knew him, and they knew that his life had value, and they knew that there were character traits that had merit and decency, kindness, generosity, thoughtfulness. All of those things that Mr. Lurie is going to talk to you about in great detail. And of course, the unfortunate reality is that nobody can deny that because Timothy Brenton is dead, that the Brenton family is denied that. But nobody can ever bring anybody back. But the fact that your value as a person to these people is significant is a product of that 41 years, and it's not to be held against somebody. It's to be understood as a wonderful representation of humanity. Paraplegic and body vulnerability, we know what that's all about, and it's not factored into any of the statistical models. He just put it in there because he says, well, common sense would kind of tell us that this is something that just doesn't in any way, shape, or form be something that is going to make him more likely or more prone. It's going to weigh on behalf of less likely to act. And to my incredulity, serving a life without parole sentence. Can you go to the next? That's the last one? All right, I must have changed my mind. You'll have to remember the data. Serving a life without sentence, these long-termers adjust to prison, and they understand the rules, and they know what benefits are available, and they adapt very well, and they have a lower frequency of violent action than almost anybody else. So paradoxically, that actually improves your statistical infrequency, or reduces your statistical frequency of having a disciplinary dangerous activity in prison. So the state didn't rebut that. In fact, there was not even any cross-examination. Dr. Cunningham did his usual thorough, professional, well-qualified job of explaining it all. It exists, its mitigation, and it in and of itself is enough for you to conclude that it's appropriate to stick with the presumed life sentence. Nothing more. You don't need anything more than that. That alone is enough. You can find in your thought processes that he's put away for the rest of the life, and the instruction says, and he will die in prison. And he can have his broken body taken in his chair to spend the rest of the life doing penance for the terrible thing that he did. And that should be adequate. That is the last of the statutory mitigating factors. The age issue is kind of an ambiguous one. But I believe that in judging a life, as Ms. McDonald alluded to, if you have 41 years of successful effort, where you have overcome obstacles that Mr. Lure is going to elaborate on in great detail, that you can factor in that age and view it favorably on behalf of a life sentence. So what I believe we're requesting of you is care, energy, mental energy, and industry in scrutinizing this snapshot. You've been able to look into the window for a brief glance to the best of our ability to not try your patience too much, but give you an idea of what this man's life might be worth and why it is certainly worth saving. If you approach your analysis that way, I believe that there is 1 or maybe 12 or some number of individuals that will find it appropriate to extend that tiny mercy. And I thank you for your attention, and Mr. Lure has comments for you.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good afternoon again. It was a little less than 2 months ago I stood up here and spoke to you. And I began by asking a question. And the question was why? Why did a 41-year-old man with no criminal history, no history of violence, come to believe that he needed to kill police in order to save his community and in order to save American society from what he thought was the gravest threat facing all of us today, police brutality? Well, the question today is no longer why. You've considered the question of why, and you concluded that Chris Monfort was able to tell right from wrong with respect to his actions. Whatever you concluded about his mental illness, you concluded that he could tell right from wrong and that he was not insane at the time he committed these crimes. And we accept that verdict. We recognize that you arrived at that verdict only after days of deliberation and careful consideration. So today, the questions that you're going to need to answer are how and when. How will Chris Monfort die? And when? When will he meet that ultimate fate? You've already decided where. That question is no longer on the table. Chris is going to live out his remaining days, his remaining months, his remaining years in prison, in a small cell, under close scrutiny, never to breathe free air again. And he'll live out those days confined in a wheelchair and in significant pain from the injuries and other medical conditions that you heard testimony about in this phase of the trial. So the question remaining is whether you sentence Chris to the second harshest punishment recognized by law, life without the possibility of parole, or whether you sentence him to die at the hands of the state. Now, the state stood up here this morning, the prosecutor stood up here this morning and tried to tell you, tried to suggest to you that life in prison without the possibility of ever being released is somehow not really that much punishment. They described it as simply changing residences. As if by sentencing Chris to life in prison, you'd be forcing him to move from Ballard to Green Lake, changing residences. That is, without a question, one of the most disingenuous and misleading arguments I've ever heard. They know full well that life in prison for Chris Monfort would be a harsh and extremely difficult fate, and one that he would have to endure for the remainder of his time on Earth. It is not just changing residences.
Your Honor, I would object. There's been no evidence about Mr. Monfort's confinement at DOC. There was no testimony about that.
Objections overruled.
You all know better than me, and it's astounding that they would even put that out there. And although we believe that the correct answer in this case is clearly a life sentence, we also recognize that there's a tremendous burden placed now on each of your shoulders. You know, thankfully there's very few of us that will ever have to decide whether a fellow citizen lives or dies. And as difficult as it is for me to stand up here right now, and with Chris's life at stake, I know that your jobs are all far more difficult, because each of you now has to decide, based on your own individual beliefs, your own individual moral judgment, whether Chris is going to live or be executed. Now, you've been given instructions by the judge. The law does provide you some guidance in making that decision, in answering that question, but ultimately it's up to each of you individually to decide. And unfortunately, the question that you're required to answer is really anything but crystal clear in its wording. The question is, and you've heard this read before, having in mind the crime of which the defendant has been found guilty, are you convinced beyond a reasonable doubt that there are not sufficient mitigating circumstances to merit leniency? And that's not really that easy a question to decipher, to really understand what it is that you're required to answer. It contains a double negative and some poor choice of words. Leniency is one of those poor choice of words. And I think even the judge sort of alluded to this in the beginning of his instructions today. We're kind of hamstrung by the legislature in giving you this question you have to answer. Leniency is a poor choice of words because the reality is there is no lenient sentence possible in this case. None. You need to decide between the two harshest punishments allowed under Washington law. Leniency in this case, and the instruction tells you that, means a sentence of life without the possibility of parole. That's in instruction number 3. And it's something we discussed at length during the jury selection process. And as the instructions also tell you, make no mistake about this, life without the possibility of release or parole means exactly that, and nothing less. Chris Monfort will spend the rest of his days, however many he has left, behind bars in a Washington state prison. He's never going to get out. The community will be safe. A sentence of life without parole will ensure community safety. Chris will never be a danger to anyone again. He will be severely punished. There is nothing whatsoever lenient about a life sentence. But that's the language in the law, that's what it sets out, and that's the question you need to answer. This isn't some type of academic exercise. When the prosecutor finished up, he said, you know, what you need to do is look at that question and check yes, answer yes. And that sounds like kind of I don't know, you know, kind of a clinical, analytical thing. Answering yes means you're sentencing Chris Monfort to die at the hand of the state. And answering no means that he'll be sentenced to life without parole, a lifetime behind bars. There's a couple of other important parts about that question that you need to answer, that you need to consider. One of them is the burden of proof. As Ms. McDonald and Mr. Gruenhagen have already touched upon, the state has the heaviest burden recognized by law, proof beyond a reasonable doubt. And what they have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt is that all of the mitigating evidence you've heard in this case, in both the guilt-innocence phase and in this penalty phase that we just finished, all of that mitigation, and there's a lot of it, is somehow not sufficient to support a sentence of life without the possibility of parole. And you know, this whole burden of proof thing gets a little confusing because the state has the burden of proving that a life sentence is not adequate, that there aren't sufficient mitigating circumstances. And yet we're the ones that spent the last 6 weeks putting on testimony, putting on evidence of mitigation. They haven't really presented you any evidence that there is not sufficient mitigation in this case. It's an incredibly heavy burden, and it's one that the state has entirely failed to satisfy. Now, over the course of this trial, you've heard a great deal of mitigating evidence. Mr. Gruenhagen has talked about some of it, what we call the statutory mitigating factors. Evidence about Chris's mental illness. And there's a lot of evidence about Chris's mental illness. Most of it presented during the guilt-innocence phase. There was weeks of it. And there was no expert that testified in this courtroom that said Chris Monfort is not mentally ill. And that includes the state's expert, Ronald Schouten. You heard evidence that Chris has no criminal history whatsoever. This is not a career criminal. This is somebody who is facing criminal charges for the first time in his life at age 41. There's evidence that Chris is not a danger to harm others in the future. Those are all factors laid out in instruction number 5, and Mr. Gruenhagen just spent some time explaining those to you. But instruction number 5 also tells you that you can consider any other factor that in your moral judgment supports a life sentence. Any fact about Chris, any fact about his life, any fact about his character, that for you individually, for each of you individually, supports a life sentence rather than the death penalty. Those are mitigating circumstances. And one single mitigating circumstance is enough for you to vote for a life sentence. So what I'm going to be spending most of the time here is talking about these additional mitigating circumstances, the ones that aren't listed out explicitly in the instructions and in the statute. They're kind of broken it down into 10. You've heard evidence, you've heard a lot of evidence about mitigation. You've heard a lot of evidence about Chris's background, his life, his family history. But there are 10 specific circumstances I want to talk about. And they're as follows. First, that Chris was abandoned by his parents at a young age on several occasions. It's what Dr. Shout and the state's experts referred to as multiple disrupted attachments, what Dr. Brahms called multiple points of abandonment. 2, Chris grew up with a mother who was severely depressed. 3, Chris was bullied, constantly bullied as a child, both in Hartford City and Bethel, Alaska, for an extended period of time stretching from about age 7 to about age 14. 4, he grew up in a highly racist climate in Hartford City. He was personally subjected to racist attacks from the time he was a young child. 5, there was evidence Chris suffered from emotional and behavioral problems growing up. A lot of people recognized it, but there was little effort ever made to get Chris the help that he needed, even though recommendations from counseling were ignored. 6, life in prison will be especially hard and severe for Chris due to his physical and medical conditions. 7, Chris believed his actions were right. As deluded or misguided as those beliefs may be, he believed he was doing the right thing. 8, Chris has made a good adjustment to incarceration. There's every reason to believe that that will continue. 9, Chris has many family members and friends who still love him. They care for him, and they will suffer greatly if Chris is executed. And 10, Chris has been a positive influence on others, on other people throughout his life. He has shown kindness and caring to other people. He has volunteered to help other people. Now, some of these factors are pretty self-evident from the testimony you've heard, and I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time elaborating on some of them. Others I am going to go into more detail on. But all of them, every single factor I've just listed, is a reason for a life sentence in this case. Now, some of the factors I've mentioned deal with Chris's childhood, his development, his upbringing. And you've heard a lot of testimony from witnesses on both sides that childhood development is extremely important in determining how a person turns out. There's a natural tendency to ask despite that. We saw it in some of the questionnaires. Okay, this person may have had a bad childhood. What does that have to do with this case? Isn't that just the abuse excuse? I want to be clear. Chris Monfort's background, his developmental history, his upbringing, his abandonment, the racism, and the other factors that Mr. Gruenhagen already talked about, these are not excuses for his crimes. We are not offering you excuses. Excuses would be a defense to the crimes. Excuses would be a reason not to punish him at all. Excuses would be a reason to find him not guilty. These are not excuses. We're not asking for that. We're asking that you impose the second harshest punishment recognized by law in this state. You have found Chris guilty of 4 very serious crimes, including aggravated murder. The issue before you now is not excuses. It's a thorough examination of Chris Monfort, his background, his life, his character, the evidence in this case, his mental state, his lack of criminal history, in an effort to decide whether Chris Monfort is one of those few people, one of those very rare individuals who is so completely devoid of any spark of humanity, any shred of humanity, that only sentencing him to die would serve justice in this case. And he's not. The answer to that question is no. And the answer to the question that you're called to make, the answer that you're called to give in that verdict form, the correct answer to that is no. The state has not proven beyond a reasonable doubt that there are not sufficient mitigating circumstances to support a life sentence. It's not even close. I think it's clear from all the evidence you've heard and seen that despite the egregious crime that Chris committed when he killed Officer Brenton, and it's a terrible crime, nobody's disputing that. Mr. Grunhagen told you that. Ms. McDonald told you that. Despite that, Chris is not somebody who is lacking in basic human decency. He's not a career criminal who chose to do wrong again and again throughout his life. He's not someone without a spark of humanity, and he's not someone so irredeemable that a death sentence is the only possible justice for his crimes. Dr. Schouten told you, the state's experts told you, that Chris Monfort cares deeply for other people. He's a flawed and damaged human being who committed a terrible crime. But these are not excuses. They're sound and compelling reasons for you to impose the second harshest punishment allowed by law, life without the possibility of parole. Now, you've heard a lot about how Chris was abandoned at a young age, what Dr. Schouten called disrupted attachments. Susan Monfort put Chris up for adoption when he was born, put him up in a Catholic orphanage. She did so in part because she was on her own. Her father, John Monfort, felt that Susan's unborn child would be better off being raised by black parents and urged her not to tell her mother. Just put the baby up for adoption. So she did. And Susan had good reasons for putting Chris up for adoption. Her life was unstable at that time. She had dropped out of college. She was living in a rundown apartment with Woody Taylor, who had done nothing to support her during her pregnancy. In fact, Woody wasn't even around when Susan went into labor. And neither was anybody else. She had to take a taxi cab to the hospital to give birth. Those are the circumstances in which Chris Monfort was born into this world. Susan thought so little of Woody Taylor and their relationship, she didn't even put his name on the birth certificate. She left that blank. So she puts Chris up for adoption, and after a few months, he's still not adopted. Nobody in Denver in 1968 wanted to adopt a mixed-race baby. So Susan took him back out of the orphanage and brought him home. We know from Cam Martin that Susan left Chris behind when she returned to Hartford City later that year for Cam's wedding. But more importantly, about when Chris was about, I guess, 14 to 18 months old, she left him for an extended period of time with Woody's sister, Inez. And you heard from Inez in her video recording, her video testimony. She loved Chris. They became incredibly attached during the summer he lived with her. When Susan came to pick Chris up, he yelled and screamed for Inez. He wanted his Aunt Inez. And it was really a traumatic scene at the airport. Everybody described it as that. Cam Martin described it that way. At that point, when she went to go pick him up, Chris didn't know his mother. So at about age year and a half, he's torn away from the one person he's most attached to. We know that he didn't recover from that separation quickly. Inez Williams testified that she had to go out to Las Vegas at Thanksgiving that year because Chris needed to see her. Susan and Woody flew him out there. So there's no question that there are these disrupted attachments that Dr. Schouten and Dr. Brahms talked about. The question is, that I'm sure you're asking, what does that matter? What does any of that matter? What does that have to do with crimes that Chris committed when he was 40 years old? First off, as an aside, but mitigating circumstances don't have to have anything to do with the crime. They can be totally unrelated, and instruction number 5 explains that to you. But in this case, you do have testimony connecting Chris's disrupted attachments to the crimes he committed. Dr. Brahms explained that connection, and so did Dr. Schouten, the state's expert. In his report, he said that Chris's actions, these crimes, ultimately devolve from a lifetime of multiple disrupted attachments, racial prejudice, chronic low self-esteem. In his testimony back in May, Dr. Schouten elaborated on what he meant by that, how Chris's background, his childhood experiences, made him particularly vulnerable to adopting the beliefs that led him to commit the crimes in this case. The state's expert is giving you that causal connection. He's describing for you how these developmental factors, these multiple disrupted attachments, led to Chris being more susceptible to committing this type of crime. Mr. Barrett asked Dr. Schouten, this wasn't one of the purposes for which you were retained, but as you reviewed the information in this case, did you come up with any theories about how it was that Mr. Monfort was moved in the direction he finds himself here? And Dr. Schouten said yes, and he went on to explain that the history that he learned from all the materials in this case, including Mr. Monfort, was that there were lots of abandonment, reactions to the abandonment, being isolated, separated from his mom, never having a stable relationship with his father, being bullied as a child, being a victim of racism as a child, struggling in school, some physical fights. And Dr. Schouten explained that those led to Chris being who he is. They carry through to adulthood. He said, to me, I interpret that as him finding a way to address many of the injustices that he experienced in his life. And when he's talking about that, he's talking about the beliefs that compelled him to take action against police brutality. So there is that connection. There is a causal connection. These early factors do relate to the crimes in this case. Dr. Schouten himself, this is a state's expert. He went on to tie Chris's beliefs about police brutality to these early experiences. He says he wants to do the right thing, he wants to do good, he wants to correct injustice. So, you've heard everybody talk about how Chris Monfort believed what he was doing was right. As mentally ill as that was, those beliefs didn't arise in a vacuum. The seeds are sown in his early childhood experiences, including those multiple disrupted attachments you heard testified to by a number of witnesses, particularly Inez Williams. This type of developmental history matters. It matters a great deal. Dr. Schouten explained that as a result of that, Chris never felt part of the community. He moved 5 times, from Las Vegas to Indiana to Denver to Alaska, back to Indiana. Dr. Schouten said these are very disruptive. These create a very disruptive sense of community and stability. Now, it's easy to say that's all ancient history, but Dr. Schouten told you that these multiple disruptive attachments, they do more than just make for a bad childhood. He said it's in childhood when the damage gets done. And that's something you need to keep in mind as you consider the significance, the importance of these mitigating circumstances we're talking about. Childhood is where the damage is done. Dr. Schouten said as adults, people become wary, they become suspicious, they have difficulty relating to other people, getting involved in relationships. These are all features that the state's experts saw in Chris Monfort himself. And you heard evidence about these long-term effects from lay witnesses, from people who knew Chris throughout his life. He became wary and suspicious as an adult. You remember David Hanning's testimony about how when they went into the park in Los Angeles, and there was a rustle in the bushes, and David's thinking, let's get away from this, and Chris has a gun and he starts walking towards the bushes. That's hypervigilance. That's a classic symptom, an adult symptom of somebody who suffers from these type of disrupted attachments. And I'm not the one telling you that. It's the state's expert that told you that. You also heard about the impact of these periods of disrupted attachments from Dr. Brahms, how the timing was a huge issue in this case. And they had a profound impact on Chris. And they helped determine who he became as an adult and the choices he made as an adult. It's not in isolation. Another thing that affected him greatly was growing up with a mother who suffered from severe depression. You heard a lot of testimony. There's absolutely no question, there can't be any question in anybody's mind, that Susan Monfort, for most of Chris's childhood, was severely depressed. There's also no question that Susan Monfort loves her son, loves him more than anything else, and that Chris loves his mother. But you heard a number of people describe Susan as fear-based. Remember Rosie Porter, Susan's friend from Bethel, Alaska. She told you about conversations she had with Susan about when Susan was growing up. And Rosie recalled that Susan would try to protect her family, but occasionally she'd talk about her father's drinking and how nobody could talk at the dinner table because of her father's temper. She said that Susan talked about her dad's temper. She just had the feeling it was such fury, something that imprinted itself on her mind and soul. You heard firsthand about John Monfort's temper and his drinking from Nancy Lord, about the incident at Thanksgiving where he knocked Nancy Lord's mother into some shelves because he wanted to go take, I think 7 or 8-year-old David Monfort, Susan's brother, wanted to take him out shooting rabbits after he was drunk, after he and Nancy's father were drunk, and that's his reaction. He knocks Nancy's mother into the shelves. Nancy Lord at age 7 or 8 was terrified of John Monfort at that moment. So you also heard Nancy talk about Susan telling her about dinners, about how she was always on eggshells. She was always kind of afraid at dinner time because John had been drinking and you didn't know if he was going to lose his temper. There was one incident where he knocked everything off the table because he was drunk and lost his temper. And the fact is that for Susan Monfort, things didn't get any better after Chris was born. She allowed herself to get dragged into a lifestyle in Las Vegas that was against her upbringing in rural Indiana. In Chris's early years, she was dominated and controlled by Woody Taylor, who moved her to Las Vegas. It was years before Susan was able to break away from that life. Chris was over 5 years old when they finally moved out of Vegas. And when she moved back to Hartford City, Susan was ashamed and guilt-ridden about her life in Las Vegas and about the fact that she'd put her son up for adoption. Nancy Lord, who testified for, I think, all of a morning, part of an afternoon, or at least most of a morning, she was Susan's best friend during those years, during those 5 or 6 years. This is when Chris is in elementary school. And she saw Susan Monfort's depression firsthand. They spent 3 to 4 nights a week sitting outside in her, in their house in the country. They were smoking pot. They were talking about their lives. And nearly from the outset, Susan was racked with guilt over the fact that she had moved Chris to Hartford City. Nancy recalled her saying, one of the things she said was, "I can't believe I did this to Chris. I just can't believe I did this to Chris." And Susan said many times she thought it would have been better if she had let Chris get adopted rather than taking him out of the orphanage. She described how at times Susan wasn't able to cook or take care of things around the house because she was depressed. Nancy Lord said, "It was the most severe depression I've ever seen in a person." And it didn't get better when Susan moved to Bethel with Chris. Rosie Porter described to you about how Susan suffered from bouts of depression and anxiety there. They would last 12 to 18 hours. I think there was one occasion where they had to try to find somebody that had some anti-anxiety medications. These are not infrequent events, according to Rosie. They came on fairly regularly, and they greatly affected Susan and her ability to be a parent for Chris. After 2 years in Bethel, Susan moved back to Hartford City, and according to Nancy Lord, she was even more depressed at that point. Nancy told you about one time she had a date to go to a ball game. And before her date showed up, Susan showed up unexpectedly, and she was so depressed that they went up to the bathroom, and Nancy told her kids, when my date gets here, tell them I had to go deal with a family emergency, because she couldn't leave Susan alone at that moment. She'd never seen anything like it. She said, "I never saw her come out of it. I really didn't." So, how was Chris functioning while growing up with a mother who's so profoundly depressed? Well, you heard evidence of that. He wasn't functioning well at all. There was plenty of testimony about the long-term effects that growing up with a depressed mother can have on a person. In Chris's case, those were even worse because he didn't have a father, really. Woody Taylor lived in Los Angeles. Chris would go see him for a couple weeks in the summers, and even that in and of itself is a pretty questionable decision. Dan Fruits, who you heard from as well, by his own admission, he didn't really know how to be a father. He never understood the responsibilities, didn't take those into account before he married Susan Monfort. So Chris grew up with a mother who loved him, but was too chronically depressed to be an effective parent, and no father. Dr. Brahms explained to you in considerable detail the long-term effects of growing up with a severely depressed mother. She described about 7 or 8 different impacts. I'm not going to go through all of them, but there was that lack of serve and volley, which results in higher levels of anxiety and stress, lack of positive parenting, toxic child stress response, which can make people more vigilant and untrusting as adults. And she told you that Chris Monfort, by all accounts, had a high anxiety level his entire life. You heard evidence of that from Marietta Wolf, who administered psychological testing to about 2,000 kids over the course of her career. This is a career educator, a career school psychologist. And of those 2,000 kids, she had never seen anyone with as high an anxiety level as Chris Monfort when she tested him in the 9th grade, and she remembered that vividly 30 years later. That's the kind of impression it left on her. Chris's reaction to taking those tests. Dr. Brahms told you that children of depressed mothers have higher rates of mental illness, which we also see in Chris's case. And the state's expert pretty much agreed with everything Dr. Brahms said about the effects of maternal depression. He said, well, it relates to attachment. The parent who is depressed is there, but not fully present. The child may make extra efforts to get attention, but the mother's really not there, not providing the usual parent supports that the child needs. So the two experts, the defense expert and the state's expert, in terms of the effects of maternal depression, these disrupted attachments at an early age, they're in agreement that these are important, that these determine adult outcome, and that they affected Chris Monfort, and that they affected his thinking, that they were influences, that they were factors in where he ended up and where he's here today. The next factor I want to talk about is bullying. You heard a fair bit about that. While Chris is adjusting to having a depressed mother, he moves to Hartford City, and you heard plenty of testimony that Hartford City was no place for a mixed-race child in the 1970s when Chris grew up there. But aside from the racist taunts, aside from the slurs, Chris was also intimidated. He was picked on, he was beaten up by his peers, both in and out of school in Hartford City and Bethel. In his interviews with Dr. Schouten and Dr. Cunningham, Chris talked about getting bullied in Hartford City. The state says, well, the only documentation we have is this 6th grade which said he was the bully. Well, you heard him talk about it in his interviews with Dr. Schouten. You heard Dr. Cunningham talk about it. He described the physical bullying, how it became increasingly frequent by about age 8, how he learned to curl up into a ball to avoid getting hit or kicked in the face or stomach. You think that's something that he's making up? You have in evidence the essay that Chris wrote years later while he was in college. And I want to say this is like 20-some years later. This is when he's in his 30s. He's at Highline. And the essay talks about his experiences in Hartford City. During my freshman year, my primary concern each day was getting a seat close to the exit, and if not, getting a teacher to escort me to my next class. Always outnumbered, my brown skin and curly hair brought me daily violent physical and verbal attacks. Outside of school, it was quite common for adults to shout or spit at me. When walking to the library, I always kept one eye open for beer bottles thrown my way from moving cars. I was failing all my classes. That's Chris's description of his 9th grade year in school in Hartford City. Now think about that for a minute. Now, years later at Highline Community College, Chris Monfort still recalls the specifics, the graphic details about the bullying and abuse he'd suffered as a freshman in high school. Now, if you have any doubt about how Chris was bullied in grade school, take a look at that picture, that drawing that he made, we're thinking somewhere in the 3rd class, that Dr. Brahms talked to you about. And there was some question about whether Chris drew it, whether somebody who was trying to bully him drew it and left it in his desk. Dr. Brahms had to allow for either possibility because Chris and Susan had both said, well, they weren't sure. It might have been drawn by somebody else. I think it's pretty clear that that drawing was made by Chris. It was signed by him. And it's a clear cry for help. Why won't you play for me? Why won't you play with me? If somebody else had drawn it, why would Susan Monfort have kept it all these years? I don't know about you guys, but I don't remember anybody when I was in 3rd or 4th grade drawing anything like that. I don't remember anybody with pictures like that. And that drawing is completely consistent with the testimony you heard from Mary Jo Myers, Chris's babysitter one summer. She told you about that summer, how pretty much nobody ever came over to play with Chris in Hartford City. And how when she went to the pool, went to the public swimming pool, people stayed away from her. Now that's Hartford City. That's not to mention what happened in Bethel, Alaska. We know how bad it was there. We have direct testimony of that from Tony Gross. Now, you heard You all heard Tony Gross. You saw him sitting up on the witness stand. Tony hasn't talked to Chris in about, I want to say, 30 years, since Chris left Bethel. Tony recounted his experience in Bethel for you, and you got to watch his demeanor. Can any of you, seeing how Tony testified, listening to him, have any doubt that he was traumatized growing up in Bethel, Alaska? Just the tenor of his voice. I mean, Tony Gross is an example of the long-term effects of bullying. It was so bad at times in Bethel that Tony left school in the middle of the day. He ran home. Rosie Porter came home, remembers coming home a couple of times, finding him there in the middle of the school day and saying, you got to go back to school, Tony. There was one guy, one friend, during his childhood in Bethel that actually tried to stand up for Tony and defend him. That was Chris Monfort. Chris was the only one that ever stood up for Tony when he was getting bullied. And as Tony told you, Chris often paid the price himself. Chris got bullied. Chris got beaten up. Tony remembered Chris coming home from school with marks and bruises from getting beaten up. You heard from Vicki Malone, who, as an adult during that same time period, was involved in the Bethel school system, and she confirmed that bullying was a severe problem there, but that nobody did anything about it until years later, I think 1997, she said, years after Chris moved away, because that's when one of the first school shootings ever happened in Bethel. And when they started investigating the school shooting, they learned that bullying was behind it, and that bullying in the Bethel schools had been a tremendous problem for years. It's a grim and scary place for a kid, and it was back then. You recall Susan's letter to her parents where she says, school's been real hard for Chris. The kids have been real tough on him, rough on him. He just feels so alone. He's real intimidated by the Eskimo kids. And we know from both Dr. Brahms and Dr. Schouten how devastating the long-term effects of bullying can be. Dr. Brahms testified about current studies, and what they're learning now is that the impact of childhood bullying is far worse on adult outcomes than people previously thought. There are studies now that show that children who are bullied are 5 times more likely to suffer from depression and 2 times more likely to suffer from anxiety than children who are physically beaten or sexually abused. So think about that. That's the effects of bullying. It leads to a greater likelihood of developing delusional disorder. Dr. Brahms testified to that. And that's certainly significant in this case, based on everything you've heard. And she explained that these effects last into childhood. She talked about how bullying affected Chris specifically, what it meant in Chris's case. As he grew up, he became more vigilant, more anxious, less trusting. And according to Dr. Brahms, Chris Monfort had it a whole lot worse than most of the kids in the studies that she was talking about. But it's not just Dr. Brahms. Once again, we have testimony from the state's expert, Dr. Schouten. And I think that's important because, as Mr. Grunhagen said, Dr. Brahms and Dr. Schouten are in agreement on almost all of the aspects of the importance of these developmental factors. The state can't distance itself from its own expert in this case. Dr. Schouten testified about the devastating effects that bullying can have on a person throughout their lives and into adulthood. He said it interferes with one's attachment to the community. You don't have a sense of where you are and a sense of belonging. That there's a sense of fear, you can't trust anybody else. He said it can affect both a person's biological and cognitive functioning, make them hypervigilant, fearful, and constantly watching out for threats. It's a source of psychological stress. Now, all these factors I've talked about, the disruptive attachments, the bullying, growing up with a depressed mother, all of those are tied to the crimes Chris committed in this case. And the bullying, I think, of all of them, I mean, they're all important, don't get me wrong, but I think the bullying in many ways is the most significant. Because think about the testimony you heard from Chris's more recent friends, Joe Blennis, Jordan Dudash, Will Bukema, in the guilt phase. They talked about one incident of police brutality that affected Chris more than the others. You heard about it from Jane Storrs too, and that was the Malika Calhoun video. 15-year-old mixed race girl getting beaten up badly in a holding cell by a very large male officer while his fellow officer stood by. I'm not going to replay that video for you. I'm sure you remember it well. I'm sure you remember Jane Storrs' description of how Chris reacted when it came on the TV in the lunchroom at the juvenile detention facility. How he just froze. He went into a whole different world, as if it was happening to him. So if there's ever a graphic example of bullying, it's that Malika Calhoun video. And it's no accident, members of the jury, that seeing that video is what drove Chris over the edge. That's what drove him to go to war against police brutality, against police bullying and brutalizing citizens. A video of a young girl, a young mixed-race girl, getting beaten up by a large officer. You know, it's entirely fair to say that in Chris's mind, you know, he believed that he needed to stand up for that girl and for people like her, just like he stood up for Tony Gross back when he was in junior high school. I think the bullying and the racism kind of goes hand in hand to a large degree. You heard a lot about Hartford City, the town where Susan grew up. You heard about racist attacks against Chris himself. They began even before they moved to Hartford City. On the drive to Hartford City from Las Vegas, they're in a restaurant, fast food place. They're eating and somebody walks up to the window and spits on it because Susan's there with her mixed-race son. He was once in Hartford City. Chris Monfort was the only black kid in town, the only black kid in school, the only black kid in the local playground, the only black kid in the local swimming pools, the only black kid in the restaurants. And he was reminded of that fact every single day. Nancy Lord told you about the time that she was walking with Chris and her kids when a couple of kids Chris's age walked by. They hurled racist taunts right in his face, real loud as she described it. And that Chris just looked stricken. She said it was like a little kid thinks, well, I haven't done anything. Why are people not liking me? It wasn't just that one incident. Nancy Lord kind of took care of Chris every day that one summer, and she recalled that they would go eat in a local restaurant called Ivanhoe's. And there would always be people nudging each other, kind of elbowing each other. Hey, look over there. And they knew it. They knew what they were doing. I mean, Nancy Lord knew right away why they were doing that. They were staring at the mixed-race kid that was sitting at the table. And Chris knew. Chris knew why they were doing that, too. Happened every time they went out. Mary Jo Myers, Chris's babysitter, remembered a time when they were at the community swimming pool, and one time there was a kid talking to Chris in the pool, and their parent actually came out and took him away. Now, those are anecdotes. Those are specific anecdote stories that you heard that reflect part and parcel the fabric of Hartford City, Indiana, and of surrounding small towns when Chris was growing up. But you also heard from a couple of people who have studied the history of racism in that region of Indiana. Professor Pierce of Notre Dame and Bill Munn, a retired school teacher, local historian. And why do we put those guys up there? I mean, you heard the specific anecdotes involving Chris. Why put up a couple of academics? Well, what they provided you was kind of an objective, detached account that verifies these anecdotes you heard about, and that kind of puts it into a context. That racism was prevalent in Blackford County and surrounding areas when Chris grew up there, and that life as the only mixed-race child would inevitably have been an extremely difficult and traumatic existence. Professor Pierce, he described it better than I could. I mean, I think he really gave us all a good account of what it was like. And he's not a whole lot older than Chris, maybe 6 or 7 years. So, he grew up in that area, and he was familiar with it during a relevant time period. He talked a lot about Indiana history. He maybe went a little too far back. I don't think we needed necessarily to know all about the glaciers. But, the fact is, he also told you about the history of the Ku Klux Klan there. He told you that a lot of this stuff was before Chris lived there, but those racist attitudes that were reflected in those pictures you saw, the lynchings, those still prevailed when Chris Monfort was growing up. Yes, the one picture of the lynching was taken in 1930 in Marion. But the fact of the matter is, those attitudes hadn't changed. There weren't lynchings anymore, but the racism was still there. And Professor Pierce talked about that. He talked about drive-by cities. He said, you know, you got flyover states when you're flying across the country, that parts of the country you skip over. Well, in Indiana, we had drive-by cities. Towns where blacks didn't stop. You just drove through. And he talked about sundown cities. Now, those were towns where blacks were allowed to come to work during the day, but they sure had to be out by nightfall. And members of the jury, that's not ancient history. Okay, we're not talking about the 1930s. That is the Indiana that Chris Monfort grew up in the 1970s. And Professor Pierce explained experienced a lot of these same racist attitudes when he was growing up. But he had it different than Chris. Professor Pierce lived in a black neighborhood. So he said, you know, he could come back. He could come back home where he's not isolated, where he has a community, where he has relatives that are supporting him. That's not what Chris Monfort had. Professor Pierce let us know his impression of what it would have been like to grow up in Hartford City. He said, I went into that with him in pretty good detail. You know, I asked him, you know, how those things, I said, in combination, he said, those things alone and in combination can lead to an adult who's angry, hostile, hypervigilant, has a profound sense of having been treated unfairly, and sensitive to further injustices. And Dr. Schouten agreed that these factors contributed to the mental illnesses that he diagnosed in Chris. Now, he didn't diagnose him with delusional disorder. He diagnosed him with several different personality disorders. But he did believe that those personality disorders are kind of what made him susceptible to adopting the beliefs he did and acting on those beliefs. So, thank you, Ron.
Could I have an issue I took out regarding juror privacy?